Hmm. All right, it's 1 o'clock. And today's Tuesday, so we're going to continue working in English literature. We're going to begin reading Homer's Iliad today. So last week we started with an introduction, and we're going to begin today simply reading through the Iliad, and I'm going to help you to understand the content of it, how to read it, how to make good use of these studies. And just like with Aesop's fables, I think you're going to see that there is an incredible amount of information in this work that most people don't realize because they don't meditate on it, they don't respect it as the kind of work that it actually is, as I described last week, that it's much more than just a story. It's considered by the ancient Greeks to have been an inspired religious work, something like the sacred scriptures among Catholics. And there's a lot more in it than most people realize. It's intended for meditation and reflection. And you're going to see as we go through this that we can teach almost any lesson in life out of the Iliad. It teaches us moral philosophy. It teaches us natural philosophy. It teaches us theology, on and on and on. This work by Homer is sort of like a one book curriculum for a classical education. And my goal in going through this together is to help you to see that and understand that so that you can actually appreciate these works and get out of them all that they offer. Now, when we get started here, we're going to move very slowly in the beginning because there's just going to be so much new information and so much to talk about that's probably going to be new to you. But it's not going to go that slowly for long because we're going to get more and more comfortable with it, and I'm going to need to give less and less explanation. But what I'd like to do is start slow and go through it carefully to really unpack all of the information so that you can get a taste for just how much there is, and you can start to appreciate this book. And then as you study it on your own and get into other classical literature, you'll know how to read them. You'll know what to look for, and I think you'll start to appreciate classical literature more. So last week I gave a bunch of introductory information and really just got us ready to get started with this study. This is a course that most high school age students really struggle with, the English literature course. Even students who are in high school, just in the high school program, they can usually get the composition exercises done. They can usually get grammar done, but they really struggle with English literature because this is a real different level of study. If you're going to really get beyond just basic storylines and get into the real stuff of it. So I want you to realize that in the English literature assessments, there are a number of questions that I ask for every lesson. I ask questions like, what do we learn about moral philosophy from this lesson? What do we learn about natural philosophy? What do we learn about Greek religion? Where do we see figures of speech? Where do we see Homer actually demonstrating for us the art of rhetoric and composition? Where do we see things like that? So students really struggle to answer those questions, and I'm going to help you so that those become easy answers and you begin to move more quickly through these courses. So let's go ahead and get started here. I've got the text up on the screen, which hopefully you can see. And I'm just going to read this and provide commentary. And what I recommend is that you sort of follow along with me, jot things down that you find helpful. And if any questions come up, we'll stop once in a while and I'll ask if there are any questions, and you can ask those questions at that time. But I'd like to just walk you through this and read it for you and explain it as we go, and then answer those assessment questions for you to show you the kind of stuff that I'm looking for in those assignments. And I think it'll be helpful. And like I said, we'll start off slowly And then as we go week by week, you'll start to get more and more comfortable with the reading. You'll know what to look for. You'll know what it feels like to read it rightly, and you'll start to appreciate it, I think. So to get started, let's just go back to the top, even though I read this a little bit last week just to get started. Let's go back to the top, and we'll read a little bit more today and then talk about its meaning. So listen to the rhythm. Remember, this is poetry. It's iambic pentameter. That's an English meter that's used to translate classical Greek and Roman epic poetry. So learn to get used to the meter, learn to read it. The key to reading poetry is to just read it slowly. You have to go slowly. That's what makes poetry sound nice. You can't read it like a history book. So read it slowly, pay attention to the rhythm, and get used to the poetry as one part of this study. But then after reading the poetry, let's get into the content of it and really draw from this reading everything that we can draw from it. So I'm going to begin at the top here. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, and such the will of Jove. Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung thee fierce strife, from what offended power? Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. So here we have our introduction to the Iliad. I explained last week that right in the beginning, we learned the theme of this whole book, which is the wrath of Achilles. It's a moral philosophy study of the vice of anger and the danger of anger and its effects. Achilles' wrath is the theme, and Homer is praying to this spirit of poetry, this muse, to reveal to him the history, the details of what happened between Achilles and Atrides, which means son of Atreus. It refers to Agamemnon. What happened back then that led to this massive outbreak of a plague and tons of deaths among the Greek soldiers when they were fighting against Troy? What happened? I wasn't there, Homer says. None of us were there. So how can we possibly know unless the goddess or the spirit who was there can share that with us and tell us what happened? So he prays to this muse for inspiration. So there was a fight between Achilles and Agamemnon, and just so you know some of the history, and again, I don't know how much all of you know about this, but what happened in the Trojan War was there was a king in Sparta named Menelaus. He was the king of Sparta, and he had a wife whose name was Helen. She was the queen. In Troy, there was a king named Priam, and he had a son named Paris. So Paris was the prince of Troy. Menelaus was the king of Sparta. Helen was the queen of Sparta. Menelaus, the king of Sparta, welcomed Paris, the prince of Troy, to stay with him, to stay in his home as a guest while he was traveling. So Paris stayed with the household of King Menelaus in Sparta. But while he was there, he seduced Menelaus's wife, the queen Helen, and she chose to run away with Paris and return to Troy. And so it was this great public scandal and offense that humiliated King Menelaus and obviously provoked him to want to go to war, because this was an offense committed at the level of kings and princes. This isn't some private affair. This was a public scandal. But there's more to it than that, because in the Greek religion, hosting travelers and being hospitable towards strangers was one of the most important religious duties. Remember, in the ancient world, there were no highways, there were no hotels, there were no airplanes or airports. Travel was very difficult. It was very dangerous. It was very uncomfortable. And the only way that anyone could travel in the ancient world was if others were hospitable, if others opened their homes and provided a place to stay and food and so on. And so showing hospitality to strangers was like the ultimate test of a person's religion and virtue. It was the ultimate mark of generosity and kindness towards one's neighbor. It's a work of mercy. And so in welcoming Paris into his household to stay, Menelaos was acting religiously. He was showing this spirit of hospitality to Paris. And Paris, by taking advantage of Menelaos's hospitality, committed the ultimate religious offense, which is to sin against your host. So in Paris, we have sort of an extreme example of sin and pride and irreverence towards the gods and towards men. In Helen, the woman, we have sort of the ultimate infidelity, the ultimate, dishonoring of one's husband. And then in Menelaos, we have the ultimate offense, a man opening his home, making himself vulnerable to a stranger, and then having that stranger take advantage of that situation and seek to injure the host. It's sort of the ultimate suffering that a person could endure for the sake of religion. So it's much more than just a romance. Most people who read this story will think this is like a romantic story where Helen runs away with Paris and then Menelaos is angry and they're fighting over a woman. That's hardly any of the story that's actually here. This is a religious lesson about the danger of sinning against against the gods, about committing moral evils and paying the consequences of them. It's a lesson about righting wrongs, about justice, all these different moral, philosophical topics and things like that. There's much more to this than just some romantic story about the queen running away with some handsome boy. So I want you to see that this is a religious story for the Greeks. This is offensive because it's an offense against religion. Paris violates the privileges of hospitality, which is a major scandal and religious offense. Menelaos suffers the worst humiliation and offense by having a guest in his house take advantage of him and commit the greatest imaginable evil, which is seducing his wife and leading her away. One other thing I want to mention that's going to be strange for you as you read this. If this was a modern story, we would all think that Helen was an evil, unfaithful woman because she leaves and goes away with this other man. But as you read this story, you'll see that Helen is never spoken of badly. She's never criticized in the story. And the reason why is because the way that women were thought of in the ancient world, and you can debate this, whether this is good or not, women were seen as weaker than men. Women were seen as dependent on the kindness and protection of men. And so for a man to come in and lead a woman away from her husband, all of the guilt of that would have been put on the man. The man was the guilty party here. So Helen really doesn't get criticized much because she's seen as being taken advantage of by a man. And so all of the guilt is placed on Paris, the Prince of Troy. So if you read this and you wonder why it doesn't seem to attack Helen at all, it's because of the way that the ancient Greeks looked at women. They believed that they were weaker than men, they needed to be protected, that men could easily overpower women and things like that. So there's not much guilt imputed to Helen for what happened. All of the guilt is assigned to Paris, okay? But I want you to understand that this is much more than a romantic, controversy. This has to do with politics, this has to do with justice, this has to do with religion, and much more. So that's why this issue, for a Greek reading this, it would have been very scandalous, sort of like sacrilegious and religiously offensive, what Paris did. We don't think about this much because if your family is traveling, you rarely stay with you rarely stay with other people. Usually you reserve a hotel room and stay in a hotel. So we don't have this personal dependence on other people when we travel. So we can't imagine, I mean, you could imagine how offensive it would be, but it's hard for us to relate just because this is not how we do things in modern society. So you've got to get yourself back into that society and think about what it would be like to be constantly welcoming people into your home, providing them with a place to stay, providing them with meals, making your family inconvenienced by their visiting and staying with you, providing all their needs. You can imagine how uncomfortable and inconvenient that always was in the ancient world. And it was a sign of a person's religion that they would be willing to be hospitable and welcome strangers. And we see the king of Sparta was such a person. He was willing to open, even though he was the king, he was willing to open his household and welcome and host strangers, which was, the ultimate sign of kindness. So that's the story here. What happens is the Trojan War develops because Menelaus basically calls up all his buddies, his fellow kings, and he says, hey, listen what happened here. The Prince of Troy was staying with me as a guest, and he stole my wife. So this was a massive scandal. So all of the other Greek kings got together with Menelaus and basically sailed to Troy to demand that Helen be returned to Menelaus. So that's the cause of the Trojan War. It's not just a romance, though. If it was just a personal romance, all of these other kings and soldiers and armies would not be involved. I mean, just think how ridiculous that would be. If, some guy lost his girl and a major war broke out. That's not the story. Okay, the story, this is religious, this is political, this has to do with the whole system of culture of Greek society. And that's why a whole war develops after this stealing of Helen by Paris. So Agamemnon, he's the brother of Menelaus. Agamemnon is the king of Argos, which is another major Greek city-state. So Agamemnon is the king of Argos. His brother Menelaus is the king of Sparta. He's the one who's offended. Agamemnon is more powerful than Menelaus. Agamemnon actually organizes the Greek army, and he becomes the leader of the Greeks. So even though Menelaus is the main guy in this situation, Agamemnon becomes the leader because he's more powerful than his brother Menelaus. So Achilles, this other character, Achilles, he's not a king, but he's a famous warrior. He's actually, in their mythology, he was considered to be a son of one of the goddesses. And so he was given this supernatural strength and power in war that was related to his supernatural anger or wrath. So he was just a bad dude, Achilles. So he was the greatest warrior in the Greek armies, and Agamemnon was the chief leader of the Greek army. He was the king of Argos and the leader of the Greeks. What happens here in this story, we're told by Homer, is that these two men, Achilles and Agamemnon, Atrides, same person, they got into a quarrel about something during the Trojan War, and it caused Achilles to separate himself and leave the Greeks without their greatest warrior. And that led to all kinds of problems. And so the story is investigating what happened that brought this fight between Achilles and Agamemnon and caused all of this trouble. So that's some background introduction there to the story. So that's how Agamemnon gets involved. That's how Achilles gets involved. But this whole entire war is centered around a battle between Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and Paris, the prince of Troy. Okay? So let's see what happens now. All of these people die. We read about all these mighty chiefs, that is, all these leaders and these other people from these other Greek cities who come and join the Greeks to fight on behalf of Menelaus. They come together, and yet there is this massive outbreak of a plague. Something happens that causes a plague to break out among these Greek men. And in ancient Greece, anytime something like that happened, they understood that something like a plague could only happen if the gods were involved. It had to be permitted by the gods. So something had to happen. The Greeks, after all, think about it. The Greeks are fighting a just cause. They're the good guys. They're the ones going to right this wrong. They're coming together to help Menelaus and fight for a just cause against this wicked prince of Troy. Why is there a plague breaking out among the Greek armies? They're the good guys. That's the dilemma, okay? So Homer is going to investigate that to figure out what happened that caused the good guys to get punished. He says in this second paragraph, declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife? From what offended power Latona's son a dire contagion spread and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead? What Homer asks is, what happened? Notice it says a dire contagion spread. That's referring to the plague that broke out among the Greek armies. What happened that caused this plague to break out among the Greek soldiers? He refers to Latona's son, and you can see even in the note in the book, it tells us that Latona, she was one of the goddesses. Her son is the god Apollo. He was the one responsible for this plague breaking out. And so Homer's asking, what in the world could have happened that would have caused Apollo, the god, to strike the Greek armies with a plague when they were actually fighting for a just cause? Why would the Greeks be suffering? So that's the question. There's this mystery in the Trojan War as to why the Greeks suffered some obviously divine punishment when they were actually fighting a just cause. So Homer is praying for understanding of this issue as he goes. Here's the answer to the question. The king of men, his reverend priest defied, and for the king's offense, the people died. This is the answer. This is the cause of this outbreak of this plague. The king of men, that refers to Agamemnon, the king of Argos, who's leading the whole Greek army. He's referred to here as the king of men because he's the most powerful of all of these chiefs of the Greeks. He's the king of men. His reverend priest, his refers back to Apollo, the god. So the king of men, Agamemnon, defied Apollo's priest. And we're going to learn this story as we get into this. But one of Apollo's priests came to Agamemnon about a problem, and Agamemnon showed no respect to this priest, but defied him and disrespected him. And it says, and because of the king's offense, the people died. So because the king committed this sin, King Agamemnon, who's fighting a good cause in this war, because he chooses at this one point to disrespect one of Apollo's priests, Apollo punishes the Greek army with a plague and causes the death of all these men. Now, again, I said we're going to start very slowly because there's lots and lots to unpack in all of this. So what I want you to look at how Homer is showing us the complexity of human experiences, that they're complex. You can be on the side of the good guys and still suffer because it's not that simple. Agamemnon, a good guy, gets punished because in the midst of his good action, he dishonors one of the priests of Apollo and offends against religion. He commits a religious offense and is punished for it. And notice the principle. For the king's offense, the people died. So it's not just that an individual man does something bad and the gods punish him. Because he's a king, because he's a public authority, when he commits an offense, his people suffer for it. And so notice that we're going to start getting into political science now. We're going to start talking about politics, that the king's offenses are punished upon the people of their kingdoms. And therefore, you have to ask the question, how should the people respond when the king is acting sinfully? Should the people submit to a sinful king? Should the people stop a sinful king? Because what this tells us is that the gods will punish the people when the king sins. For the king's offense, the people died. And this also raises questions for us about religion. This is what the Greeks taught and believed about the gods. The Greeks taught that if a political authority commits a sin, the god may punish the entire kingdom, the entire people of that king. So we can look at that and say, well, is that something that a god would do? Is that something that the true and living God would do? Does our God do that? You know, for example, if I sin and I'm the head of a household, so I'm like a king with reference to my family. If I sin, will God punish my family because of my sin? That's a religious question for us to reflect on Greek religion and realize what this is telling us about the gods, that the gods are overseeing the affairs of men on earth, from the lowest people all the way up to the kings of the earth. And they're constantly watching and judging and executing justice among men based on their actions. And it can get very complicated because you can have men participating in a good cause, and yet if they do something bad, the gods will interact and punish them for their bad deed. So you can see how this starts to open up questions of religion for us. We've opened up questions of moral philosophy and ethics. We've opened up questions of religion and how the Greeks viewed the gods and how they understood events that take place among men. If a plague broke out among men, the Greeks wouldn't ask, oh, what virus could be causing this plague? They weren't naturalists. They weren't materialists. If there was a plague that broke out and men were dying right and left, the Greek people understood that this could not possibly happen unless the gods allowed it. And therefore, there must be some spiritual reason for this outbreak of this plague. And the remedy for this plague is not for us to try to find a vaccine or to try to find some kind of medical solution. The need is for us to try to figure out what the spiritual cause of this punishment is, and then try to deal with that cause. And normally, the way that the problem would be dealt with would be to find out if there was a God, or if God was offended by something somebody did, to find that out, to punish it among men, to punish it, and then to offer sacrifices to God as, you know, as a penance for the wrong that was done, to try to regain a right relationship with God so that the plague could be ended and peace could be restored. So that's how Greek religion worked. And if you think about that, and remember, I said last week, we have to be careful criticizing Greek religion because they're dealing with what could be known at that time in that place. They're dealing with what they experience. They're dealing with what they think and reason and experience, and they build a system of religion based on their experience. The fact that they even believe gods exist is a relatively good thing, because to be materialistic and believe that there's no God, there's no angels, no spirits, no heaven, no hell, no soul in me, that's even worse than to believe something that's not entirely true about the gods when you're dealing with, you know, a lack of revelation and you're just trying to understand to the best of your ability. So we can see the Greeks interpreting human experiences and explaining them in terms of the relationship between men and the gods. And the different gods were understood to be concerned with different issues. So the reason why there are different gods is because we can see that there are obviously different issues in life. And the way that the Greeks thought of it was that different gods or goddesses took personal concern with different issues in life. So it's not that crazy when you understand what they actually believe. And it's not evil when you realize that the gods here are punishing evil deeds among men. So it's not like the Greeks are teaching, hey, you know what? The gods want us to do evil things. The gods love sin. The gods love for us to be evil and immoral people. That's not what the Greeks believed at all. The Greeks believed that the gods were very strict. And if men did bad things, the gods would punish them. And it made the people fear the gods and seek to live according to the rules of, respect for religion, respect for your neighbor, and so on. So as we read through, we want to constantly keep a mental list of bits of information that we learn about the Greek religion, because we're going to find that much of what the pagan people believed, much of it was true. It was simply imperfect. Much of it was true. And when Christianity comes, Christianity doesn't just destroy everything. Christianity isn't a bulldozer that goes into the world and just roots out all existing culture and society and religion and replaces it with something completely different. That's not what Christianity even is. Christianity goes into places where they've already got a lot of the truth figured out, and Christianity brings it all to perfection. It corrects the errors. It fills in information that wasn't available to the people. It teaches them things that they couldn't possibly have understood, that they're not accountable for because they're impossible to know, like the Trinity. There's no way that anybody could figure that out. So God's not going to punish some ancient Greek because he didn't believe in the Trinity. It was impossible for anyone to understand that. So when Christianity comes into a place, it finds that much of the truth is already there, and it seeks to keep that, to preserve that, to keep that, not to disturb that. But then it seeks to identify the things that are not true and explain the truth, explain the better solution to those things, and then to also reveal the things that can't possibly be known, which are received by faith. And faith is a divine gift. So you can't beat somebody over the head for not believing, because God has to actually give a person the grace of faith to believe, and that's not in our control. So we can't penalize people for not believing, because that depends on grace. And the only reason we believe is because God has given us that grace. So to think that, well, we're smart, we're Christians, and these pagans, they're all dumb, they don't believe, that just shows that you don't understand what faith is, and that you're not appreciative of grace that you have received and live with, which is why you think differently than other people. So it's important for us as we study Greek religion to see how much of it is true, and then to identify what's false, and then to see how Christianity corrects what's false and brings it all to perfection. That's how the conversion of the world actually works. So look at their religion and see how it's like Catholicism. We teach much of the same thing. We teach that if you sin, God becomes angry with you, and you can separate yourself from a relationship with God by disobeying his commands, by not living according to his commands. You can actually separate yourself from God and gain for yourself punishment from God. And we believe very much like the Greeks that if you sin against God, it's your responsibility to figure out what you've done wrong and go and make amends for it. You have to do that. You have to get up, get out of your house, go to the church, and you've got to confess your sin. And not only confess your sin, you've got to do penance for your sin, which is an offering. Just as we'll see, the Greeks make an offering. You've got to make an offering of satisfaction for your sin that you've committed. And you've also got to promise to change your life and not do it again. So we can see that what we have to do as Catholics very much parallels what the Greeks understood about their relationship with the gods. Of course, it's not perfect what they believed, but we can see how the truth in sort of its basic form is already there. The gods are virtuous, and they are the defenders of justice in the world. If you do something evil, you're going to be punished. And once you begin to suffer that punishment, you need to you need to amend your life, confess your sin, and do penance in order to be restored to friendship with the gods so that your punishments can come to an end. That's very much like Catholic teaching on how to deal with sin. So we can see that the Greeks, what the religion that they had, even though it's got errors in it, even though it's imperfect, there's a lot of it that's true and good. And that's what we should pay attention to and respect, and realize the other stuff gets taken care of when Christianity comes and cleans it all up. It's not that big of a deal. So again, as you read this, I want you to pay attention and just, gather together all the bits and pieces you can of Greek religion and just sort of assemble them into a big description, so you start to get a clear picture of what the Greeks believed about the gods. You'll find that it's not as crazy as modern people pretend it is. So anyway, there's this fight that breaks out between Achilles and Agamemnon. A plague comes and punishes all the people, and Homer asks, what in the world happened that would get all these people punished? And here we have the revelation. Agamemnon offended a priest of Apollo. Apollo inflicted the Greek army with a plague, and because of the king's offense, the people died. So here we have the revelation of the cause of this. Okay, so let's keep going here. Chryses, now we're introduced to the story of what happened. What exactly happened? How did Agamemnon offend against the god Apollo? Chryses sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. Suppliant the venerable father stands, Apollo's awful ensigns grace his hands. By these he begs, and lowly bending down, extends the scepter and the laurel crown. He sued to all, but chief implored for grace the brother kings of Atreus's royal race. Now, if you're reading that by yourself, you probably have no idea what that's talking about. So let me explain all of this. And that's why I said we're going to go slowly as we just learn all of the details of what's going on, and then you'll be able to read on your own more and more. We're introduced to this person named Chryses here at the top of this first line. Chryses. Chryses is the priest of Apollo in this story. Chryses is the priest who Homer just referred to. He's the priest of Apollo, Chryses. We're told here that he sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. So Agamemnon, who is the leader of the Greek army, he is winning in war. And as they go through this war, they're taking Trojan people captive. And so they've got this whole band of captives that they've taken control of. One of the people that they took captive is a girl. We're going to see her name later. Her name is Chryseis. It's a little further down. Her name is Chryseis, and she's a girl who the Greeks just happened to sort of collect as they gathered captives together in the war. But this girl is a special person. This girl is the daughter of Chryses, who is Apollo's priest. So this girl, there's a special girl who's been taken captive with the Trojan captives. Her father, the priest, being this, reverend, this respected priest of the god Apollo, he comes to speak to Agamemnon about his daughter and to say, you happen to have taken my daughter as one of your captives. I'm a priest of Apollo, and you've got my daughter among your captives. I'd like to ask that she be released because she's my daughter. And the right thing to do for Agamemnon, out of respect to this priest, would be to honor his request and let his daughter free. Chryses, the priest, sought with costly gifts. In other words, he brought a ransom to Agamemnon to offer as a gift in exchange for his daughter, and they were costly gifts. He didn't come with $10 and ask for his daughter to be released. He came with costly gifts, respecting Agamemnon, even though he was a priest of Apollo. He came respecting Agamemnon's right to take captives, offering him costly gifts as a ransom for his daughter. It says he bowed down. It says, with these things, Apollo's awful ensigns. That means he came dressed as a priest of Apollo, which should have made Agamemnon careful. He came dressed like a priest of Apollo, a religious man, and showed Agamemnon the signs of his priesthood, which should have been respected. He bowed down before Agamemnon, showed great humility and respect for his authority. And it says he sued to all. That means he asked the Greeks to be merciful to him, to have mercy on him as a father, and grant the release of his daughter. But chief implored for grace the brother kings of Atreus's royal race. So the priest of Apollo actually bowed down before the Greeks and begged them for mercy for his daughter, who was one of the captives, and offered gifts to the Greeks as a ransom. It says the brother kings. The brother kings refers to Agamemnon and Menelaus. The brother kings of Atreus's royal race. They're the sons of Atreus. That's why Agamemnon was called Atrides before, the son of Atreus. So the picture here, to make this simple, is that in their fighting, the Greeks are gathering together captives. One of those captives happens to be the daughter of the priest of Apollo. That priest comes, shows complete respect for Agamemnon, bows down before him, although he doesn't need to do that at all, offers Agamemnon expensive gifts as a just ransom for his daughter, humiliates himself. And what we're going to find as we keep reading is that Agamemnon, in his pride, being puffed up with pride, chooses to just ignore this priest, reject all of his gifts, have no respect at all for his request for mercy, and sends him away humiliated. Because Agamemnon disrespects the priest, Apollo the god is offended, and Apollo responds on behalf of his priest and punishes Agamemnon and his army. So that's the story of what's going on here. It's described in poetic form, so it may be difficult to follow the story, but that's what's going on. So let's keep going here. Ye kings and warriors, this is the priest speaking. This is his message to Agamemnon. Ye kings and warriors, may your vows be crowned. So he blesses the Greeks. He says, may your vows be crowned. May your promises be fulfilled, and may you be blessed for your vows. May Troy's proud walls lie level with the ground. Again, the priest of Apollo blesses the Greeks and essentially prays for the success of their war against Troy. May Jove, that is Jupiter, the chief god, may Jove restore you when your toils are o'er, safe to the pleasures of your native shore. In other words, may Jupiter bring you all back home safely and restore to you the peace and prosperity you enjoyed before this war. So Chryses here is just being as respectful and friendly and generous as he possibly can, blessing and praying for the success and happiness of the Greeks, whose cause is just. Then he says, but I have to ask this, but relieve a wretched parent's pain, and give Chryseis, his daughter, to these arms again. If mercy fail, yet let my presence move, and dread avenging Phoebus, son of Jove. So here's the priest's message to Agamemnon. God bless your effort. God bless your fight with Troy. It's just. You deserve to win. May God give you success. and prosperity. However, I have to ask you to relieve a wretched parent's pain, relieve my suffering, and give my daughter back into my arms. That's what he says. And then he says, if mercy fails, if you're not moved by mercy to return my daughter to me, if mercy will not move you, then let my presence, that is the gifts that I offered, these religious, costly gifts that the priest offered, let these presents move you. And what he's saying is, if mercy will not move you, then let justice move you, because I'm offering a fair gift as an exchange. So my request is just. I'm not just coming here asking for a free gift. I'm coming asking for your help, but I'm also offering a just ransom for my daughter. If mercy doesn't move you, then let justice move you and accept these expensive gifts. And then he warns Agamemnon, let my gifts move you, and let dread avenging Phoebus move you. And so the priest warns Agamemnon not to reject his request, because he's a priest of Apollo. Phoebus is just another name for Apollo. Dread, terrifying, avenging Phoebus. Think about him and let him move you to hear my request and grant me back my daughter. Okay, so that's the priest's message to Agamemnon. He couldn't be more friendly and, good-natured towards the Greeks. He pleads for mercy. He offers a just ransom for his daughter, and he presents his authority and significance as a priest of Apollo as reasons why his request is fair to ask. Everything he does is respectful and proper. Notice the next passage. It says, the Greeks in shouts their joint assent declare. All the Greek people agreed that the girl should be restored to the priest. The Greeks in shouts their joint assent declare. All the Greek people say yes. The priest to reverence and release the fair. Give back this beautiful girl to her father, the priest. That's the will of the people, the will of the Greeks. But not so Atrides. And again, that refers to Agamemnon. Not Atrides. He doesn't agree with the Greek people. He, with kingly pride. So what moves what moves Agamemnon? He has the pride, the arrogance of a king. And there's an important word to learn in Greek history. I'm going to put it in the chat so you can see it. The word it's pronounced hubris. And you'll hear this as you read literature. Hubris. Hubris in Greek is this idea of pride, where men, when they become wealthy or powerful, they no longer fear the gods and see themselves as inferior to the gods, but they begin to think of themselves as if they are one of the gods. And so they begin to ask, why do I need to show respect to this priest? I'm King Agamemnon. This priest should show respect to me. And so he responds with this kingly pride, with hubris, showing no respect and thinking of himself more highly than he should. He responds with kingly pride. He repulses the sacred sire. The sire means father, and sacred refers to his priesthood. Sacred sire, this priest who is the father. And he replies with these words to Chryses. And we'll read this, and then this will be the end of our lesson today. Agamemnon responds to this priest in kingly pride, contrary to the will of all his Greek people, and says, hence, that means get out of here. Hence, on thy life. In other words, get out of here or I'm going to kill you. Hence on thy life, and fly these hostile plains, nor ask presumptuous what the king detains. Hence, get out of here, hence, with thy laurel crown and golden rod, nor trust too far those ensigns of thy God. So he basically says to him, take your religion and get out of here, to this priest. And he does this out of kingly pride. Mine is thy daughter, priest. Notice the disrespect that Agamemnon speaks with. Mine is thy daughter, priest, and she shall remain. And prayers and tears and bribes shall plead in vain, till time shall rifle every youthful grace, and age dismiss her from my cold embrace, in daily labors of the loom employed, or doomed to deck the bed she once enjoyed. Hence then to Argos shall the maid retire, far from her native soil and weeping sire. So Agamemnon's response to this priest is as disrespectful and offensive as you could ever imagine. Not only does he say, get out of here, he says, get out of here with your religious nonsense. He says, your daughter is my property, and I'm going to bring her back to Argos, where she's going to serve as one of my servants until she's an old lady. So get out of here. So it's just all arrogant, disrespectful, prideful treatment of this priest by Agamemnon. And he tells him, get out of here. She's mine. You have no right to even talk to me. I'm a king. Who cares about your religion or your status as a priest? I'm a king. I do what I want. So the trembling priest along the shore returned, and in the anguish of a father mourned. Disconsolate, that means unable to comfort himself. Not daring to complain, silent he wandered by the sounding main. Main is another name for a sea. So the priest left and, mourning and not able to even think of what he could possibly do. He's just wandering along the coast, pacing, thinking about what to do, unable to comfort himself, until at safe distance to his God he prays, the God who darts around the world his rays. So this priest offended goes off and prays to Apollo. That's his response to this offense from Agamemnon. And we're going to stop there. And let me just wrap up real quick. Politically, we see that there's a relationship between a king and his people. And so the question is, should the king do his own will, or should the king honor the will of the people? So you can see how this question of politics is here. This priest comes along, asks this favor from the Greeks. All the people say yes. The king says no. The king acts disrespectfully and commits an offense against the God. The priest goes away, and what does he do? His only weapon is to pray. Remember yesterday in Aesop's Fables, we talked about the creaking wheel. Well, this is the creaking wheel, right? The weak, all he can do is creak, and prayer is his creaking. So the priest goes away and he creaks, and he prays to Apollo that Apollo would do something about this. And we just learned before that Apollo is going to inflict a plague upon the Greek people. And who's going to suffer? The people. And the people who are going to suffer didn't even want to keep this girl, but they told the king that he should give her back. And yet, nevertheless, they suffer for it. And so you can see how all of these moral questions start to come up. Like, what should happen? What should happen if your king does something that the people don't agree with? Because if they allow it to happen, the gods don't care. The gods will punish the people. So if you're one of those people, what should you do? you know that if you let the king do this, the gods are going to punish you. So are you going to fear the king? Because think about it, you could say, oh, well, I'm not going to rebel against the king, because if I rebel against the king, he might throw me in jail. Yeah, well, if you don't rebel against the king, then the gods may punish you for allowing your king to do so. So what I want you to see is that there's all of these controversial questions and issues that are being raised in the story. And it's for us to meditate on the story and draw all of these questions out of what we read. These are controversial questions. What should the people do? Should the people allow Agamemnon to do this? Do the people owe obedience to their king unconditionally? Is there a time when people should rebel against the king and prevent him from doing? What's Agamemnon going to do against the whole army? He can't just do his will and the army take it. The army is more powerful than the king. So we've got all these dilemmas, and notice we've got this disagreement between the king and the people. And there's one person who says, no, I'm not going to allow this to happen. And that's Achilles. And that brings us back to the wrath of Achilles. Achilles says, no way am I going to let you do this and bring this offense upon the Greek people to have us suffer for your kingly pride. And so you can see how the stage is set for this conflict between Achilles, who, unlike the common people, is not afraid to stand up to Agamemnon and basically say to him, what are you going to do about it? Right? Achilles isn't afraid of the king. And so you can see how this situation is leading up to this conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon, which we'll get to in our next class. But I want you to see that the priest humbles himself, does everything good, and then when he's offended by the king, he turns to religion, prays to Apollo, and that's his response. And then we see Apollo in the next passage comes to the defense of his priest who's been disrespected and punishes the Greeks. And then we've got the quarrel with Achilles. So I hope you can see the story starting to come together as we get into the details. I hope you can see how much more stuff is packed into this story for a reader to meditate on, talk about, think about, write about, and so on. And then consider in our society, think of American society, how much different is American society? How much different is our culture? Compare our society to that society of the Greeks. How does our state, how do our government officials treat our religious leaders? Are they respectful to our religious leaders? If a priest went and asked one of our government leaders to do something, would the government leader respond like Agamemnon, or are our government leaders different? You can see how all of these interesting philosophical, moral, political, religious questions are being stirred up by the events in this story. And if we had, time to lay around under a tree together and just talk about these things, we could take up all these talks. And that's what the Greek men did. They would get together, read these things, talk about them, and use those discussions to ask these questions and propose solutions. And that's why these stories were so important to the Greek people. They were the source of the discussions, which led to things like the development of democracy, right? This shows us why democracy is necessary. If the people have no ability to check their king, they're going to suffer for it. So obviously that can't be the ideal form of government. And 200 years later in Greece, we find the Greek people developing the principles of democracy. So again, all of these issues are present in these stories. It's for us to draw them out through meditation. If we just read it lazily, trying to check the box and get the class done, we'll miss the whole point and value of these readings. But if you see how much is there, and I try to draw this out by the questions that I ask you on the assignments, if you start to learn how to read classical literature and realize it's not just a story, it's a book that's like a manual for every possible part of your life if you meditate on it and think about the details. Just like we learn in Aesop's fables. Take a little fable, learn how to meditate on a fable and draw from it moral lessons and applications. Learn that in Aesop's fables, and then come to the Iliad and realize you've got 24 books of this massive, massive fable to unravel and meditate on. That's the value of classical literature. That's how it was used, and that's why it's been famous all through these years. If you take some cheesy modern book that's published just to sell and tell a cute story, you can't do this with those books. These works of classical literature are different. They're written by wise men who know the significance of what they're writing, and they write it on purpose. And it's for us to read it, reflect on it, meditate on it, talk about it, draw all of these discussions out of it, and then pursue those discussions to their end. It provides us with endless study material. And that's what these books were for the ancient Greeks. So we're out of time today. We've gotten through the first, 10 or 15 lines. I told you it would be slow to begin just because we got to provide all the context and get all of the background laid out. But as we go on, you're going to understand the story now, and the reading is going to get easier and easier because you know what's going on. So it won't be that slow every week, but it'll be slow until we get all of the context laid down. So I hope that's helpful. If you're in this course in English literature, if you haven't already done this lesson, I encourage you to start working on it or go work on it now. And with all of this in mind, read book 1 of the Iliad, read through book 1 and start to understand the story for yourself. And then when we have our meetings, if you read ahead of me, you'll kind of have a general idea of what the story is about. And then I'll go through all the details with you in our meeting, and that will allow you to work through these books in a way where you really understand and benefit from them. All right. Gianna asked a question. Let me just answer this real quick. Do we need to fill out the assignment, or are we going to once we finish book 1? You can just start working through that course. I encourage you to read it yourself, because what I want is for you, and remember, with classical studies, what's so cool about classical studies is the teacher is nobody. I mean, I have no authority. What I say is subject to what the book actually says. And you as students, you should be reading it for yourself, looking at what it says. And this is true for all of your subjects. You should be looking at it yourself and say, what did Mr. Michael say about this? Is he right about that? Is that right? Well, wait a minute. I read in this line that he says that, you should realize that these texts are the authority. The scriptures are the authority. The catechism's the authority. Classical writings are the authority. And so we're discussing and studying these things. And what you have to learn is that, you have the responsibility, you have the right to read the text for yourself and ask whether what others say about them is true. You should not be afraid to argue or object or ask a question. That's what classical studies are. And you'll find that one thing that's good about real classical teachers is that they're not afraid of that kind of questioning, because they're honest and they actually are trying to understand the text that they're reading. And if there's something that they get wrong, they're happy to find it because they'll correct it. So read it for yourself. Don't study like a dum-dum. Study to become an independent, thinking Christian adult. That's the goal of these studies. So I want you to read it for yourself. Listen to what I say, read it for yourself, and ask, is Mr. Michael right about this stuff? Is Mr. Michael right? Think about what Mr. Michael says about the Greek religion and the gods and the goddesses. Is he really right? I'm going to read this for myself, and I'm going to see if he's really right. Is this really good, or is their religion really evil? I'm going to look for some clues that say Mr. Michael's wrong, because I think he's wrong. That's how you should read. You should read looking to the text as the source and not being afraid to contradict other people who have their own opinions or interpretation, but let the text have the ultimate answer and appeal to the text as proof for what you have to say. Okay, so I want you to read it for yourself, answer those questions, and begin to learn how to use classical literature. So that's all for today from me. If you have any questions, you can fire away now. Okay, rhetorical figures. Good, real quick. Let's talk about rhetorical figures. A rhetorical figure, just to put this as simply as possible, a rhetorical figure is any kind of speech where we move away from the simplest, plainest language to try to have some effect on the people that we speak with. Okay. Any use of language that moves away from simple like robot talk to try to affect or influence a reader, that's figurative language. That's what we mean by rhetorical figures. So if we look through this, let's just try to find some, let's see. I mean, here's an example. In this third line, rather than say a bunch of Greek people died, Homer says that these people were hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign. You see how he describes the underworld as the place of death because he really wants to create this haunting feeling that something terrible happened. He could just have said who hurled them to death, period. But that wouldn't have had the same emotional impact on the reader. So he uses this description of death as Pluto's gloomy kingdom under the earth, right? You can see that's a rhetorical figure. Continuing to go down here, let's see. Here's an example of hyperbole. Latona's son heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. Were there actually mountains of dead bodies? No, it's a rhetorical figure. It's hyperbole, okay? It's intentionally exaggerating to make a point that this wasn't a couple people dead. We're talking about piles of dead bodies, mountains. It's hyperbole, mountains of the dead, okay? That's another example of a rhetorical figure. Let's see what else. Here's another example. His captive daughter from the victor's chain. What does that mean? Victor's chain. What does that mean? Well, he's talking about slavery, right? And so instead of saying slavery, he doesn't say with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from slavery. He doesn't say that. He wants to make it more personal. And to make it more personal, he refers to slavery as the victor's chain, the chain binding these captives that's held by the victor. So Agamemnon has this chain in his hand. So these people aren't slaves for any reason other than that Agamemnon holds them in chains and he has the power to release them. So he chooses to describe slavery in this rhetorical way to have a certain effect on the reader and on the story. Anything else here in the part that we read? Here's another example. Troy's proud walls. Well, walls can't be proud, right? Pride is a human attribute. So to refer to prideful walls or proud walls is an example of personification. And what does proud walls mean? It means big, powerful, high walls that seem to say to everyone, there's no way for you to get in here. There's no way for you to get past us. We're invincible, you know, proud walls. That's another rhetorical figure. So that's a bunch, you know, rhetorical figures, just ways that an author seeks to have more influence in his speech by using something other than plain language, you know, to try to bring about an effect in his hearer, where we try to actually bring our readers to feel what we want them to feel when we think that the plain word won't do enough for us. So that's what a rhetorical figure is, okay? And there's lots of different kinds, but rather than paying too much attention to the, oh, this is you know, this is a metaphor, this is hyperbole, this is metonymy. You can get into all the names of the different things, but it's really simple. It's simple. Anytime the writer uses any language that's not simple and plain to try to bring about some emotional effect, some rhetorical effect, that's a rhetorical figure, okay? So there's all kinds of rhetorical figures. That's what you should look for, okay? And again, this is how we speak as human beings. We use them all the time. If you want something from your parents, you're not going to say, Mom, may I have milk? Period. You're not going to say just a simple request with a period. You're going to dramatize it a little bit. Say, oh, Mom, I'm so hungry. I'm starving. I could eat a horse. Could I have a little bit of milk? You see how we'll kind of dress up the language. We'll minimize what we're asking for. We'll say, can I have a little bit of, we'll exaggerate our hunger. I'm starving. I haven't eaten since the last meal. I'm dying. I've got a headache. I'm having, I feel like I'm going to faint. We'll exaggerate our condition. We'll exaggerate our condition and we'll minimize our request because we can kind of anticipate what Mom's going to say, and we're trying to cut her off before she just, quickly dismisses us and says, no, lunch is in 20 minutes. We know that that's the default answer. We're trying to weasel our way in there with some emotional appeal to get a glass of milk. And so we start to change the language. We don't just come and ask like a robot. We start to, we limp into the room, maybe we mess our hair up so we look like we're exhausted and fatigued. We make a rhetorical appeal for what we desire. So we do this all the time. It's how we communicate as human beings. But I want you to pay attention for that kind of stuff in the writing of these great writers, because they're the best at it. They're great at it. That's why they're so famous, because they're so good at it. Whereas usually, we might try, but we stink, and Mom just sends us away and doesn't give us anything. So we can learn from the masters how to become more persuasive in speech. And that's part of the study of rhetoric. So you can go on later to study the art of rhetoric and learn all the rules and principles in Aristotle's rhetoric. But here, you have an example where you can just observe a master of rhetoric and see how he does things, how he brings about certain responses and emotions in us, and learn from the masters how it's done. So that's all with rhetorical appearance. I could talk about that all day. So let's get me to shut up before I get rolling here. It's already been an hour. I think we've covered a lot of material. I want you to read this for yourself. If you've got any other questions, just post them on the student forum. I'm happy to take any more now, but if you'd like to get going, you're free to go, and I'll talk to you next time. All right. God bless you all.